Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Ariel Cates. I'm the Director of Marketing at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. Now in its 24th year, the museum is committed to the crucial mission of educating our diverse community about Jewish life and heritage before, during, and after the Holocaust. As part of that mission, our programs are meant to illuminate the stories of survivors, broader histories of hate and anti-Semitism through time, stories of resistance against injustice, and the accomplishments of Jews throughout history. Today, we are here to learn about Genius and Anxiety, how Jews changed the world from 1847 to 1947. Throughout today's program, I'll be off camera, but I will be here in the chat for any thoughts that you have. If you have questions specifically for our speakers, I just ask that you please put your questions into the Zoom Q&A function. Just helps me to keep track of everything. And we'll get to as many of those as we can at the end of the hour. So it is my honor to introduce today's speakers to you. Norman Lebrecht is a historian, cultural commentator, broadcaster, and award-winning writer. His 12 books about music have been translated into 17 languages. Among his best-selling titles are The Maestro Myth, Who Killed Classical Music, and Why Mahler. Lebrecht's first novel, The Song of Names, won a Whitebread Award in 2003, and it was filmed in 2018 and 19 with Tim Roth and Clive Owen in the leading roles. And of course, we're here to discuss his most recent book, Genius and Anxiety. Matthew Goldstein is a museum trustee and is the former chancellor of the City University of New York. He was the first CUNY graduate to lead the university. Goldstein has also served in senior academic and administrative positions for more than 30 years, including as president of Baruch College, of the Research Foundation, and as acting vice chancellor for academic affairs at CUNY. So Norman and Matthew, thank you so much for being here with us this afternoon, and take us away into Genius and Anxiety.
Thank you, Ariel. Norman, thank you for being with us today, and I look forward to a lively discussion. I want to say at the start that I think you've written an important book, a book that I would recommend to many of our viewers today, and I have read it twice, in part, and before I even knew that we were going to have a Zoom call, I read it and then I read it again, which I do with books that touch me in very special ways. So if we can begin, Norman, I'd really like to start with the Dreyfus affair, which I'll talk to in a second. But before we do that, Felix Mendelssohn, a brilliant composer, conductor, descendant of Moses Mendelssohn, is a figure from the classical music world that has always touched me in very special ways. And I think your treatment of Felix Mendelssohn in the book is brilliant in that it sets forth a number of things that you refer to as existential angst. People who do very important things but have great trauma in their lives that manifests themselves in very interesting ways. Felix Mendelssohn was Richard Wagner's, as you say, bête noire, he was ruthless in his criticism of the young Felix Mendelssohn, who died at a very young age. I think it was 38, Norman. If I'm wrong, you can correct me on that. He suffered, I believe, with a lot of insecurity, manifested by his deep relationship with his sister Fanny, who was a composer as well and did not treat her well, because in part he thought it would detract from his own fame. And I think the Felix Mendelssohn story really is one that Jews have experienced throughout their history. And if we restrict ourselves between 1847 and 1947, which included 2 world wars, Alfred Dreyfus looms very large in that history. Dreyfus was an artillery officer who was falsely convicted of passing military secrets to the Germans. He was sentenced and eventually pardoned by a French president. But his trial awakens a tribal fear amongst his fellow Jews, who interpret it as a token of their marginality and therefore of their opportunity. I wondered, Norman, if you could jump in and tell us what your views are of the Dreyfus affair and why you think it was a pivotal part in the awakening of Jews in the late in the 19th century and mid 20th century to all of the problems that we actually experience today as well.
Thank you, Matthew. Well, if you don't mind, I'll start with Mendelssohn, and perhaps I'll start even a little before that.
Okay.
Genius and anxiety exists to answer a question that's preoccupied me for much of my adult life. Between the middle of the 19th and the middle of the 20th centuries, the most fertile period in human history, about 36 individuals changed the way that we see the world. Almost half of them are Jews. And that's the question. How is that possible? How is it possible that a minority of 0.02% of world population can amount to half of the new ideas that are pumping through the most inventive period ever since the creation? So what is it that propels the Jews in this period to the foreground? What is it that enables them? What is it that inhibits them? And those two things are what creates genius and anxiety. Genius is the enabler, anxiety is the inhibitor. And anxiety we see first in Felix Mendelssohn. Felix Mendelssohn was baptized as a boy. His father, he was the grandson of the great Jewish philosopher Moses Mendelssohn, who was orthodox, who was devout, who was respected as the first Jewish intellectual who was able to have dialogue with German Christians. His grandson is converted in order to help him advance within Christian society. The sons of Mendelssohn, the children of Moses Mendelssohn, came to the conclusion that the ultimate role of the Jews was to assimilate, and that's how Mendelssohn was baptized. And throughout his adult life, his short adult life, he was the perfect Christian Protestant gentleman. He was a friend of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert. He was the only outsider who was allowed into the children's rooms at Buckingham Palace, where he and the Queen would play lullabies to the children. He was beloved and respected of the kings and queens of Europe. He wrote great odes for the Protestant church. Perhaps the most famous ode that he wrote was the Reformation Symphony. The Reformation Symphony, right? A symphony in honor of Martin Luther, the man who saved Christianity, as Protestants would see it. And when you take a look at the Reformation Symphony, and this is where I started, as it were, my examination of how the minds of these inventive Jews worked. When you look at the Reformation Symphony, and you come to the third movement, you hear a theme that goes something like this. Da, 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 dum. And I'm guessing the Jewish members of the audience are going to recognize that fairly quickly if I've sung it reasonably accurately. It's Heaven Shalom Alechem, Heaven Shalom. Right, okay, it's the tune that you hear played over El Al speakers as they are about to land at Ben Gurion Airport. It is a very old Jewish tune that has infiltrated the most Christian of Mendelssohn's works, the Reformation Symphony. Obviously not consciously, he didn't plant it there. He's not waving a little blue and white flag there, but it's functioning there as a signal of who Mendelssohn really is and of how his anxiety functions. I'll give you one more example about Mendelssohn before we come to the Dreyfus Affair, and that's this. If I ask for a show of hands on chat for the most popular of Mendelssohn's works, what is going to pop up? You've got 3, 2, 1 to tell me on chat. What do you think is the most popular and important? The Wedding March, yeah, good, okay, fine. Yes, that's fairly good. No, more Wedding March. Elijah, yeah, good thought, Wedding March. Yeah, we're coming through. Aha, we got one, right, Violin Concerto. The signature work of Felix Mendelssohn, the Violin Concerto. It is the only work in which he suffers a block. Mendelssohn is a phenomenally fertile composer. He writes everything with the greatest of ease. From childhood, by his teens, people are comparing him to Mozart. He has such fluidity. When it comes to the Violin Concerto, he has a block. It takes him 6 years. No, nothing gives him so much trouble as this Violin Concerto. And he's writing it for a fellow Jew, Ferdinand David, who is his concertmaster in Leipzig. And it's not going well. In fact, it's not going at all. He can't unlock it because it is a violin concerto, and the violin is very closely associated as a Jewish instrument. And he finally finishes it. And it's ready for performance, and he rehearses it. And after rehearsal, he just goes home and lies down. He can't deal with it anymore. And when the day of performance comes, he has a headache. He can't conduct. He can't conduct his own violin concerto. And you have only to listen to the violin concerto to know why that is. Because no concerto opens with such a precipitate entry of the solo instrument. Normally, up till Mendelssohn, listen to any Mozart concerto, listen to Bach concertos. There's a lot of orchestral decorations, a lot of playing around, and eventually, once you've got used to the general background, after 5-6 minutes, the solo instrument comes in. With Mendelssohn, it comes in like a cork out of a champagne bottle. It bursts out of him. The whole of the concerto bursts out of him. It is the most intimate expression of his Jewishness that you will find in the entire oeuvre. And I give many more examples in the book, but you have only to listen to that concerto and then to look at the performing history of that concerto, almost all of which, up until the last 2 generations, has been in the hands of leading Jewish violinists, to see how this confluence works. At Matthew's suggestion, I'm going to jump forward now to the other end of the century, to the Dreyfus Affair. One of the most appalling and enduring injustices against a Jew that has been committed in 2 millennia of European history. A loyal French army officer is set up by traitors to take a fall for their own actions in spying for Germany. They blame it on Dreyfus. Dreyfus is from Alsace-Lorraine, where most French Jews, including my family, originate. And he has a German name. Because he has a German name, he is a German spy. He's condemned, he's sent to Devil's Island, he spends years in the most appalling conditions. Eventually he's brought back. Much later, he is given he's restored to the army, a broken man, but he still fights all the way through the First World War. He goes back to his regiment and he fights 4 years in the French trenches in the First World War. It was, I think, I'd need to look it up in Genius and Anxiety, I think it was only in 2006 that a French president made a formal apology for the persecution of Alfred Dreyfus and admitted that the French state had been wrong, that the army had been wrong, that Dreyfus was an innocent man, and that the whole of the French judicial process had been driven by an anti-Semitic agenda. What happens in France at this time is that the whole of society is bifurcated. You were either pro-Dreyfus or anti-Dreyfus. It was almost impossible if you were certainly if you remember the intellectual classes, it was impossible not to take sides. And in some way or other, those who took sides can be divided into the good and evil. There were people like Georges Clemenceau, the future Prime Minister of France, who was the brave man who turned his newspaper into the support of Dreyfus. There was Émile Zola, who published the famous J'accuse against the French state that was persecuting this innocent Jewish officer. There was Sarah Bernhardt, the most famous woman in France, possibly the most famous woman in the 19th century, who not only stood up for Dreyfus, but proclaimed her Jewishness and identified with him as a Jew in a way that she'd never done before. So the whole of France was split by this. And out of this, excuse me, out of this comes an unexpected byproduct. There is an Austrian journalist in Paris. He's not a very good journalist, or he hasn't been until that point. He is a failed playwright. All he ever wanted to be was somebody who put on plays at the Burgtheater in Vienna, and play after play he got turned down, so he had to get a job as a journalist. And he was lucky enough to get sent as a correspondent to Paris, and he watched the Dreyfus trial, and the Dreyfus trial made him not just a Jew, but the first Zionist. His name was Theodor Herzl. Out of the Zionist trial comes the Jewish state, which is the
irony of ironies.
Indeed. The Jewish state is the title of the work that Theodor Herzl wrote to facilitate the conditions by which humanity could never again stage another Dreyfus trial.
And Theodor Dreyfus really was the impetus, the early impetus for the establishment of the State of Israel.
Yep.
And so Dreyfus got his rewards in a very unexpected way, as you said.
This is all so coincidental, because you look at you look at the evolution of Zionism, you look at the early movements in Russia in the 1870s, you look at the way that Eliot's novel, Daniel Deronda, sparked a Zionist awakening in its Yiddish translation. You look at all of these things, you look at people like Max Nordau and various others who start coming together. Without Herzl, it couldn't have happened. For two reasons. One was Herzl was a phenomenal activist. I mean, once he got his teeth into something, this was probably the only thing he ever got his teeth into. Once he got his teeth into it, he was not going to let go until he had seen the Kaiser, until he'd seen the leaders of the various countries, until he'd actually been to Palestine, until he had created a physical presence that would be the nucleus of a Jewish state. The second was Herzl, tall man, long beard, black beard, charisma, absolute charisma. There was no one else in the Zionist movement for the next 50 years who had the power to attract and inspire and fill a room and sell an event for the Holocaust Museum, like Theodor Herzl, without that personality. And it was a deeply troubled, very self-questioning and very, very unhappy personality. But without that personality of Herzl, it is unlikely that Zionism would have been fulfilled in the way that it has been.
Yes. Sticking with the French for a while, Georges Bizet comes on the scene, writes a very controversial opera, Carmen, which people are outraged about, marries a young ingenue, Genevieve Harlevy, who is Jewish, although George Bizet was not Jewish. She gives birth to a boy who's called Jacques Bizet. And Jacques Bizet one day brings home a wonderful young friend, Marcel Proust. And interestingly, Marcel Proust has a Jewish mother as well. Although he never portrayed himself as a Jew, Jews would say that he's Jewish. He has a Jewish mother. So you have these two young boys, both with Jewish mothers. And Proust turns out to be one of the greatest French writers of all time, certainly at the time in which he is writing. But there's a paradox, which I hope that you could elucidate our listeners about. Paradox is his Jewish identity as an insider-outsider. I wondered if you could talk a bit about that. And also his magnum opus. This is Proust's magnum opus, In Search of Lost Time, where he embellishes time as an illusion. The past, the present, the future, they're all intertwined.
Thereby paving the way for someone you're dying to talk about, which is Albert Einstein.
I'm dying to talk about Mr. Einstein, sure. So that's my lead-in to that. Okay. I wondered if you could
Let me take
elaborate a bit then.
Sure. Let me take it 2 steps back. The most popular opera from the late 1860s until the present day, the absolute box office certainty is Carmen by Georges Bizet. The opening night of Carmen was attended by all the great composers in Paris, and they liked Bizet. Everybody liked Bizet. He was a really nice guy. And they all sat there shaking their heads. I mean, all the musical mavens of Paris said, he's written another flop. This isn't going anywhere. This is not going to happen. Something about Bizet, something about Carmen, they didn't get. And one of the things that I was digging into in the book is the essence of Bizet's relationship with his wife, Geneviève. Geneviève was the daughter of the composer Jacques Fromental-Halévy, who wrote an opera called La Juive, the Jewess. Actually, the first opera ever written about a Jewish woman, which itself had a great success. But Geneviève was difficult, neurotic, unfaithful, extraordinarily appealing in many ways, and extraordinarily unsettling in others. And she is, as I argue in the book, she is the model for Carmen. You do not understand Carmen until you understand Geneviève. So Carmen on stage is a gypsy. She's not a gypsy. She's not a gypsy. She's Jewish Geneviève.
Yes.
And Geneviève then becomes one of the, Geneviève has a fashion, when she, after Bizet's early death, she remarries. She is remarried by the chief rabbi of Paris, no less. And she has a salon in which all the great artists of Paris come. And her son, Jacques, brings home his best friend, Marcel Proust. And Marcel Proust becomes a protege of the woman on whom Carmen has been modeled. Marcel Proust has a Jewish mother. In some way, his magnum opus, À la recherche du temps perdu, is the product of a Jewish mother as much as it is a product of Proust himself. It is a search for the missing mother. It's a search for the mother that he doesn't want to let go when he's going to sleep at night. He's terrified. How will he ever fall asleep unless his mother is beside him? It's the product of an extraordinarily unhealthy dependence of the boy with the mother, and everything flows from that. It also flows from his envy to be part of the upper class that he's seen in Geneviève Bizet's salon, and of his desire to be accepted in this glittering society, knowing all the while that he will never be accepted, that he will always be that outsider, and that outsiderhood is what makes him the artist that he is. Within the work, I made the mistake of first approaching it in English. There is a better English translation now, but if you can read French, you need to approach Proust in French, because Proust is one of those Jews, and there are a number of them. Heinrich Heine was the first, who reconfigure their mother tongue. In Heine writes German as nobody has written German before. German, until Heine, is the German of Goethe. It's heavy. It's full of allusions. You can read 2.5 pages before you come to a verb, and it is not, to be totally impolite, borderline constipated. And with Heine, it becomes direct, often rude, fluent, fluid, lyrical, and comprehensible even to somebody who has no more than 6 months of German at school. Okay, so Heine, the Jew, shakes out the German language as nobody's done before. Proust, the Jew, shakes out the French language as nobody has done before. Well, this isn't the French of Molière. Mm-hmm. This is Proust's French, which is, it's quite highly decorated. It is extraordinarily musical. It is probably the most musical French of its time, apart from possibly the poet Verlaine. But just the opening sentence, longtemps je me suis couché de bon temps, which translates into English as, I used to go to bed early. I mean, it's mundane. But longtemps je me suis couché de bon temps is something else altogether. And as you will have heard, it's in the present continuous. It is written entirely in the present continuous. Incidentally, I've written Genius and Anxiety in the present continuous, not just because that seemed to me technically the best way to tell my story, but also because the Hebrew language exists only in one tense. Various other constructs have been put onto it in the 18th, 19th, 20th centuries, but the language of the Bible is that of the present continuous. The King James's Bible mistranslates the opening sentence of the Bible, in the beginning God created heaven and earth, which all the Jewish exegetes say is quite wrong. It is in the beginning of God's creation of heaven and earth. The earth is in chaos, blah, 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 blah. It is present continuous. It is not so much the beginning of a story as a story taken from a certain point and then carried on in transcendence of the fixity of time. Time is not fixed in the Hebrew language as it is in Greek and Latin and Western languages. Time has no past, present, and future. Time is present continuous. So from Proust and his use of language, we then come to Einstein's idea of time, which is that time is relative.
Let me jump in at this point, and then I want to loop back to Freud, which I would love to engage with you. Einstein was born in Ulm, Germany. I think it was 1879, if I'm not mistaken. Had an undistinguished childhood, but an upper middle class childhood, well educated. Gets a job as a patent officer, nearly completing a PhD in physics. No one ever heard of Einstein. And in 1905, his annus mirabilis, his miraculous year, he produces 4 works that in themselves could be awarded a Nobel Prize. They are that innovative. The photoelectric effect, Brownian motion, determining the sizes of atoms, and the thing that he is most known for in the lay world is his special theory of relativity, and goes on to develop it further in the general theory of relativity. Mark Koch, a Polish mathematician, once stated, there are 2 kinds of geniuses: ordinary geniuses and magical geniuses. Ordinary geniuses are those who do work that well-educated, smart people can understand, but they can't do it themselves. The magical geniuses, of which there are few, do work that we can understand it, but we don't know where it comes from. And I would submit that Einstein is one of those magical geniuses that comes upon the world in a very profound way. And I think, in my way of looking at the world, has had a profound impact on our daily lives and really mixes up the world as we understand it that was largely established by Isaac Newton in terms of understanding the physical world. You state 2 things in your marvelous book, quotes that I've heard before, and obviously it touched you in a similar way. Einstein once quoted, "If my theory of general relativity is correct, Germany will claim me as a German, and the French will claim me as a citizen of the world. And if it is incorrect, French will claim me as a German, and the Germans will call me a Jew." It's a delightful little thing that you would expect to hear from Einstein. Give me a sense about his importance in the world and his own connection with Judaism. I'd be interested in hearing what you have to say about that.
Matthew, I think you're absolutely right about magical genius. I don't think we will ever understand what happened to Einstein in those 3 months in the spring of 1905. We cannot see where these papers come from because they are so radical and they're so outside the frame of conventional thinking that even now, only last month, I saw a newspaper headline maybe 2 or 3 weeks ago in the Times of London saying Einstein is proved right.
Yeah, that happens about
we
every
are still we are still trying to understand what it was that brings Einstein to the point where he does. And there are certain elements here, above all the element of time, which is a very Jewish thing. And we'll come to the Jewish way that Einstein explained time in just a moment. But you asked about his Jewish background. He came from a secular Jewish background until he was about 11 years old. And then something happened to him, and we don't know what, we don't know why. But he told his parents that he wanted to be a religious Jew. He made them have a kosher household. He made them observe the Sabbath. He studied Jewish texts. He probably learnt the whole of the book of Psalms by heart. If ever you saw Einstein walking down a path in Princeton and moving his lips, he was probably reciting Psalms. He was more attached to the book of Psalms than he was to any other text. And although he declared himself agnostic, he would say that God could be found through the Psalms. After about 9 months of religious intensity, he told his parents he wasn't religious anymore, and they could convert back the kitchen, which may have come as relief. But so he knew his way around Jewish thinking, and he knew his way around Jewish texts. I'm not going to try to explain relativity, but if you look at certainly you look at the rules of exegesis as practiced by the Mishnah and the Talmud. In other words, the ways of traditional understanding of Jewish religious texts, one of the key principles is that time has no order. There is a rabbinic principle, en mukdam u'mu'achar b'mikra, meaning there is no early and no late in scripture. In other words, events that you read, the things that you're liable to read in the Bible, it ain't necessarily so. And it's the rabbis telling us that, because they're telling us this thing that happened actually happened before the event that is subsequent to it, in the event that precedes it in biblical text. So in Einstein's early understanding of Jewish thinking and of Jewish documents and Jewish studies, he realizes that time is fluid, that we don't have to accept what goes on the watch, on the clock, on the metronome, but time is within human understanding is actually a variable. Once it is variable, you can have a completely new approach to the universe. Yeah. Now, when later on, after he had the Nobel Prize, and after he became famous, and he went to the United States for the first time, and the president of the United States said he couldn't make head or tail of all of this. And there was a debate in Congress. It was a debate in Congress, I think it was in 1922. It's a debate in Congress on the theory of relativity. And only one senator claimed to have half understood it. No matter. Einstein would be asked all the time to explain relativity, mostly by journalists, and he would give them a couple of pat sentences. And if that didn't satisfy them, he would tell his secretary to tell them a Jewish joke. And the joke is this: what is the theory of relativity? He said, if you sit on a hot stove, a second can feel like an hour. If you sit with a beautiful woman, an hour can feel like a second.
Right.
That is Einstein's theory of relativity in his own word. In his own word.
he had a wonderful sense of humor, and that was his appeal in the when he met with journalists. But beyond space-time, which is itself a major change in the way in which we view the world, his notion of light, that light, no matter how quick you are moving, always looks the same, moves the same, doesn't change. I mean, he had very fundamental things about the world, that light is composed of waves and photons, particles, and that when Eddington in 1919 went on an expedition to determine if his general theory of relativity was supported by the data, Einstein went to sleep that night and said, if I'm proven wrong, I will feel bad for God or the Mighty One, because he would be wrong. I mean, it was that kind of confidence that was really so delicious. I just want to
also, I mean, we mustn't ignore this, but he also had a sense of musical time. He was a musician. He played the violin. He never went anywhere without his violin. Now, musical time is not subjective. If you're going to play violin in a string quartet with three others, you're going to have to be keeping the same time, because otherwise it's going to sound ghastly.
He couldn't do that.
But he knew it had to be done. So these are the paradoxes and the contradictions within Einstein, which make him just endlessly fascinating.
Let me just a couple of more thoughts, and then I want to loop back to another famous Austrian, Sigmund Freud. Einstein is contacted during the war by a Hungarian by the name of Leo Szilard. And he wants a meeting with Einstein, and Einstein adored Szilard, respected him, listened to him, and so forth. Szilard was one of a group of Hungarian mathematicians, like John von Neumann and George Polya, Eugene Wigner, Paul Erdős, Marcel Grossman. I mean, there's a huge group of them. And Andrew Grove, who was the former CEO of Intel, once told me the following when I introduced Andrew Grove after he gave a major gift to the university I was connected with, that the reason that all of these Hungarian mathematicians and physicists, according to Szilard, was as good as they were, is that they had Jewish teachers that could not get university positions because of anti-Semitism. And it is that group of Jewish teachers that is unknown today at all, that is largely responsible for challenging all of these men and women who were obviously gifted to do the things that they did. So, I mean, I could go on with relativity and so forth, but we don't have time. But I'd like to switch to something that
let me just chip in with Leo Szilard, because there are two really important points here.
Yes.
Three, actually. Firstly, you're absolutely right. He is part of a Jewish generation in Budapest who couldn't get into university. There was numerous classes. They admitted very, very few Jews into the scientists. Their own teachers were Jewish, and after the First World War, they all migrated to Berlin. Szilard clung to Albert Einstein's coattails in Berlin, and together they invented a refrigerator. This really isn't widely known, and they offered it to a big American firm which turned it down, and they sold it in the end to the Swedes. But he from really as a student, he was already inventing things with Einstein. And when he came to the United States in 1938 and saw what the situation was, knew how quickly nuclear science was developing in Germany, he persuaded Einstein to write the celebrated letter to Roosevelt, which marked the start of America's nuclear program, without which, who knows where we would be today. So Szilard is a figure of immense importance. He's also a very, very attractive figure, and he slipped through the cracks in history. And there's no way I was going to write this book without Szilard in the heart of it.
Yes, and I'm glad you did, because he's also sort of lost in importance, and it's a wonderful story.
Yeah.
Also involved with them was Edward Teller.
Teller from Neumann. Yeah, I mean, these guys, every single one of them.
The tour with Einstein, but was cast aside by Szilard. In the time that we have remaining, I'd like to talk a bit about one of the geniuses with profound existential angst, and that is Sigmund Freud. Complicated, to say the least, complicated with his Jewishness, complicated with his own sense of sexuality, deeply controlling, makes a major change in his early years, disavowing his theories of seduction theories, which caused him a lot of angst. People thought that Freud was a fraud. I mean, he went through a tremendous amount of anxiety and changed the world in a profound way. I know that you and I spoke briefly about this when we spoke a few weeks ago, but tell me your own views of Freud and the transformations that he experienced in his own life.
So much of Freud has been discredited. So much of the detail of Freud has been discredited that it's become quite difficult to speak in defense of Freud. But the core principle is this. Freud established the talking cure. Freud established the possibility for each and every one of us to go into a form of therapy that will enable us to achieve better self-understanding and a route to the relief of anxiety. If Freud had done nothing else, that would put him on a pedestal, and he would remain on that pedestal forever. Some of his other theories is much more controversial. His theories of sexuality, by placing sexuality at the heart of human emotion and human conflict, he was, of course, absolutely right. But many of his personal roots to that were not only wrong, they were also based on his own distortion of facts. Freud frequently tailored the evidence to fit the theory, and we see him very, very often in denial, both of the objective facts and indeed of his own of his own identity. Freud identified as a Jew. There's absolutely no question about this. There is a famous speech that he gave for his 70th birthday to Bnei B'rith, in which he defines himself fully and wholly with his brothers in Bnei B'rith and his being a Jew, albeit a secular Jew, a Jew who doesn't believe in God, who doesn't believe in any of the Jewish texts, who doesn't know any of the Jewish texts. He would write, I mean, he wrote and stated several times that he didn't know anything about the Jewish religion, that he couldn't read Hebrew, that he had no idea of what went where, and he was in complete ignorance of this, and he didn't want to know any of it. And you just have to scrape a little bit. You just have to do a little bit of fundamental research, and you see, for instance, there is a Bible that Freud's father gave to him on his 30th birthday, in which there is a fluent an inscription in fluent Hebrew, which clearly his father knew that Sigmund Freud, whom he addresses as Shlomo, his Hebrew name, that Sigmund Freud could read. Freud knew Hebrew. He knew all about the Jewish festivals. He knew the rhythms of the Jewish year. He knew all of these things. It was convenient and possibly necessary for him to deny it because some of his thinking was actually drawn from Jewish sources and possibly even from rabbinic sources. I find a very, very strong confluence between the 13 principles of exegesis that are laid down in the 2nd century AD. They're known as the Breita of Rabbi Yishmael. Between those 13 principles of exegesis, 7 can be found in Freud's rules of psychoanalysis. So he is aware of these things, if not consciously, then as Freud himself would say, unconsciously. He's deeply conflicted about the essence of being Jewish. He's prepared to have the passport, but he doesn't want the content. And that is where you start seeing the bits coming apart within Freud.
A remarkable man that has had a profound influence on every one of us.
Absolutely, without any question. I mean, my favorite story about Freud is that, I mean, this isn't something one should be proud of in any way. When he married the granddaughter of a great rabbi in Hamburg. In fact, the first rabbi in Germany to get a university degree. And when he married, he told his wife that she was not allowed to light the Sabbath candles. There was to be no religious observance in their house, no superstition, no mysticism, no nothing. It was a rational household, no Sabbath candles. And she suffered.
Yes.
And her sister came to live with them as well. And she suffered too. Her sister would light the candles secretly in her room. But Martha, Freud's wife, didn't. When Freud died here in London, just up the road, in 1938, he came back from the funeral, and the following day was Friday. And on Friday evening before sunset, Martha, Freud's widow, got out the candles and lit them every Friday night for the rest of her life.
Yes. I got a kick out of that when I read that in your book. I didn't know that at all. Norman, this has been an absolute delight for me, and I hope our audience enjoyed it. We only scratched the surface of this in an enormously important book, and I would urge everybody to get a copy of it and read it. I think.
Yes, I echo this, and I've put the link to purchase the book in the chat, and I will do that again before the end of the talk. Is it okay if I hop in and ask some questions? We have gotten a lot of questions specifically about anxiety. So we have, I'm going to try to read you a couple of them because I feel like they're all more or less asking similar, different facets of a similar thing. So we have a question about anxiety as it relates to genius, also Jewish anxiety as it relates to anti-Semitism. If you think that this was that anxiety is something that was in these geniuses' nature as Jews, how all of these things feel connected to you. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Sure. The Jews had a history of persecution in Europe, 1,500 years of it. When emancipation came, there is a theory that some of the genius, some of the explosion of ideas that came from Jews in the middle of the 19th century onwards was a result of them being allowed out of the ghettos and therefore enabled to to connect with Western society and to fructify in that way. Actually, the maths don't work because they were let out of the ghetto by Napoleon 70 years earlier. So this is 2-3 generations later where we see the genius starting to flood through. But it floods through with an awareness, an ancestral awareness of persecution. Everybody is aware all of the time that this could end at any moment. Freud makes these terrible mistakes early on in his career. At one point, he is attracted to a theory that a nasal operation might relieve hysteria. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, one patient actually dies on the table. It's not good. But he's doing it because he's running so hard. He's working so fast. And the reason he's working so fast is the fear that this could all end, that the next wave of persecution could come through, the next pogrom, the next expulsion, the next genocide. So the anxiety is embedded in the historical consciousness. I don't believe it's embedded in the genes. I don't think there is a Jewish anxiety gene, because if there was, we'd probably all go down and get it taken out. But it's not in the genes. It's experiential. It's in our common history, and it comes forth actually in the work, and we see this in practically everyone. And one of our responses to anxiety is humor. Freud, when the Nazis come, when at the Anschluss in Vienna, Freud gets paid a very early visit by the SS, who absolutely clean out his flat. And he says to them as they are leaving, he says, "Yes, gentlemen, this may be the most expensive session I've ever had." So he's prepared to crack jokes with the Nazis. It's a defense mechanism, obviously. It is a way of controlling his own anxiety. It is imbued in him probably for generations. But that's how the anxiety functions. So the anxiety, as I see it, accelerates and tempers the genius. It speeds things up. How is it possible that Einstein wrote those 3 papers in 3 months while holding down a day job as a clerk in a patent attorney's office and having a difficult marriage besides? How is that possible? Where does that speed come from?
It's incredible.
That's the anxiety, but the anxiety also tempers it by saying, wait a minute, stand back from this. Have you got it right? If you haven't got it right, this could be terrible, not just for you. This could be the destruction of the Jewish people. Quite a few of the individuals that I discussed seem to wear the fate of the Jewish people on their shoulder, to bear the fate of the Jewish people on their shoulders. Arnold Schoenberg, the great modernist, the composer, when Hitler came to power, offered to give up music and to become the leader who would save the Jewish people from Nazism. There is a sense of personal responsibility for the fate of the Jews that also goes into this, which too is an aspect of anxiety.
I appreciate that. I appreciate that very much.
Well, it's also a phenomenon of geniuses in general. They come out with radical theories that go against the grain of accepted understanding. Arnold Schoenberg. These are people who constantly had to fight to give credit and understanding to the work that they did. So Norman, you're absolutely right. So thank you for that.
So I know that we are at 3 o'clock, and I want to be respectful of your time, but if you are willing, we've still got folks here with us, so maybe we can push it and I can ask you just a few more questions. Does that work for you?
Yep,
Okay,
I can
great.
do another few minutes. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Um, wow, there are so many amazing questions here. Everyone, thank you so much for your participation. We have a couple of questions about um, about sexism and genius. We have a question about the influence of um, the devaluation of women in the psyches of the men who you've been talking about. And also we had a great question, you know, how did Freud write all these papers while he also had a day job? Nomi wanted to know, what role did his wife play in the writing of those papers?
Well, go ahead, Norman, please.
Freud's wife, Martha, was in denial. She never wanted to discuss psychoanalysis. She never wanted to discuss Freud's sexual theories. She was questioned by some of his students, and she changed the subject. So she had no direct connection and no role. His sister-in-law, Martha's sister, had something of a role. She acted at one point as a kind of assistant receptionist to Freud, but I can't say that she had any direct influence. The role of women has to be seen in terms of the general role of women in the 19th century, which was not necessarily a prominent one, but there are some prominent and outstanding Jewish women that I discuss in the book. First and foremost, Sarah Bernhardt, the French actress, who invented what we know today as the notion of celebrity. And my understanding of Sarah Bernhardt, and this is an original approach, I haven't seen it elsewhere, is that her invention of celebrity, she had to make herself the most famous person in France in order to protect herself from anti-Semitism. If she reached a level of fame that she was totally visible, nobody could attack her as a Jew because that too was out. She was completely out with everything. So she is the role model for all celebrity seekers, from Hollywood to Princess Diana to any other you care to name, who use fame both as a weapon and as a defense mechanism. And it is impossible to underestimate the role that Sarah Bernhardt plays in the French psyche, so much so that after the liberation in 1944, the first stamp issued by the République Française has the traditional figure of Marianne on the postage stamp, but the face of Marianne is Sarah Bernhardt. She is the epitome, the embodiment of French womanhood, and she is very much rather like Proust. It's another one who makes her own way in the French language. There's a particular lyricism that is described in the way Sarah Bernhardt delivered a line. There are one or two recordings that you can hear on YouTube, and it's not very clear, but her conquest of the French language in her roles as an actor was entirely individual and totally hypnotic, so much so that she could do a 150-stop tour of the United States speaking only French on stage. I don't imagine anybody could do that today.
In science, history is very clear with misogyny, of discrediting women scientists, diminishing their importance, stealing their work. I mean, there are lots and lots of examples. One that Norman covers, I think, quite well is Rosalind Franklin, who was a crystallographer, an X-ray crystallographer who discovered in one of her prints the double helix. Up to that point, people thought it was just a helix, but she actually saw the double helix, which I think Norman refers to as A and B. Yet she never was acknowledged by Watson or Crick. She wasn't acknowledged at all with the Nobel Prize that the two of them shared. That's one example. There are many, many others in the history of science that we could spend almost an hour talking about.
They stole her work and they disparaged her.
Yes, absolutely. Anything else?
Great. Oh my goodness. I could ask you questions all day long. Let me think. I think we have two questions that I'll finish with. The first is from Sarah Softness. Hi, Sarah, who wants to know if there are visual artists who are included in Genius and Anxiety, or who you would classify in that way.
There's no transformational visual artist on a level, on a par with the others. It took a little while longer for Jews to make their mark in the visual arts, possibly because of the ancestral taboo of the Third Commandment. Do not make a graven image. There's just one that I discuss in some detail, and that's Amadeo Modigliani, who was during the early part of the 20th century, a kind of friend and rival of Picasso, and had a very distinctive and unmistakable kind of portraiture with very long oval faces. Modigliani is a fascinating and somewhat tragic figure. One of the things that I like best, he used to stop, after a day's work, artists like to go out to a bar and have a drink. And for a while, he would go out for a bar with Picasso. But Modigliani, being a well-brought-up Jewish Italian boy, would only go out to a bar with a jacket and tie. And Picasso would go out in his t-shirt, in his smock. So Modigliani stopped going out with him.
Amazing. Thank you. And for our last question, hold on, let me find it. Our last question today comes from Sam. Just looking into the future and, more into the present, who do you think are modern Jewish geniuses?
That's really difficult. Does the process continue? I drew a line at 1947. I didn't want to get into end of history discussions about the formation of the State of Israel and what happens after that. But if we If we look at the 1990s and the coming of the internet and the rise of the internet engines of Google and the Facebook and various others, so many of them appear to have been initiated by people of Jewish origin. So clearly there's something still going on.
That's good. It's good to know. Well, thank you so much, everyone who has outstanding questions. I'm so sorry, and I really, really appreciate your participation. We would probably be here for another few hours, but oh, I see the link to purchase the book apparently isn't working. So I'm gonna work on that and I will include the link to purchase the book along with a link to our program survey. We always appreciate your feedback and some other information about Genius and Anxiety in our follow-up email. And we will be sending also the link to the video of this conversation so that you can revisit the stories and the anecdotes. We're so grateful, Matthew and Norman, for your time, for being here. just as a note, everything that we do at the museum is made possible through donor support. So we hope that if you're here, you'll consider making a donation to support the museum or becoming a member and joining us for our upcoming programs. I'm going to put a link about all of these things into the chat right now. Thank you again so much, everyone, for being here. Take good care of you and yours, and we hope to see you again soon.
So long.
Bye.
Thank you. Good night.
Thanks
Thank
again.
Thank
you.
you.